Thanks very much. I wanted to talk a bit to begin with about why Copenhagen was such a disaster as it was, and why it was so disempowering. Because it was a bit like when you went there, switching the light on, and suddenly realising that all the mantra around fair, ambitious, and binding deal, and everyone in all these different countries in the global climate movement beavering away, talking about how we needed 40% cuts in rich countries and significant deviation from business as usual in poor countries. It wasn't about the policy. And if we're completely honest looking back on it, it was always about the underlying politics. And so it was like switching a light on and seeing, just for a second, how constrained Obama was by the US Senate, how even progressive politicians in Europe are being held back by the strength of skepticism amongst the public, by the apathy of even progressive parts of the public, by the strength of the fossil fuel industry in Europe and in particular in America. And what's articulated a lot less, and what I think has really wound up Ed, is the absolute insistence by major emerging economies like China to not accept any kind of cuts, on the basis that they are still developing countries, they don't hold a historical responsibility, and so they shouldn't have to take on any cuts whatsoever. And so understanding the politics inside these countries, the political economy behind it, rather than the kind of policy level requirements of what we need, is going to be crucial going forward. Because I think if we just set off on the road to Mexico saying we need a fair, ambitious and binding deal with 40% cuts from rich countries, nothing's going to change. We have to face head on what were the underlying reasons. And as I say, if you're China, you're in a major emerging economy, you're faced with a growth path of economic development which looks extremely healthy from your perspective. You're going to lift millions of people out of poverty and improve prosperity and all of that. Why would you deviate from that path towards a low carbon development model that's never been tried before, that is without precedent, if the very countries which claim to talk about green growth, countries like our own, with progressive governments who accept the science of climate change and strong civil society movements and a free press, and yet we in our own country, if you look at what is happening here, we're not developing a low carbon economy, and so it's very difficult to expect major developing countries in particular to accept that they should follow that kind of path. And what's really telling is that the offer in terms of the cut in carbon on the table from developing countries collectively at Copenhagen was a more significant cut than the offer collectively from the richest countries with the most money to deal with it, the most responsibility to deal with it. And that's absolutely scandalous. It's scandalous that in a country like Britain, which is probably, well, almost without doubt, the most progressive country on the global scale. We have the most progressive minister on this issue of any major economy in the world. And yet, if you look at what we're doing here, we're committed to 80% cuts in Britain. But last year they put aside £440 million for renewable energy projects, which is less than half of what the failed RBS bankers got in their bonus packages. If you think about the scale of the transformation in our economy that we need to see away from fossil fuels and into clean energy technologies, and then you look at the scale of the investment going in, it's nowhere. Like Johan Hari said in his presentation, it's a huge opportunity to make the economic recovery about building a low carbon economy, if you like, a showroom to show countries like China and other major economies where there's much more skepticism and powerful fossil fuel interests and powerful right-wing medias like in America, that this is possible. And we don't need to sacrifice our prosperity to be able to develop our economies in a low carbon way. But if even the countries that talk on it aren't doing it themselves, then it's like a pipe dream. And so I think going forward after Copenhagen, the focus has to be on changing the politics domestically. So that last year, when they set aside the £440 million, and compare that with the £130 billion they plan to spend on Trident replacement and 2 new aircraft carriers, or the sort of money that went on Iraq and so on and so forth, all the examples everybody knows. If you compare the scale of investment, it's nothing, and the reason it's nothing is that you're faced with a strong fossil fuel lobby, a strong right-wing media, a massively sceptical public, and the progressives, people like the people at this conference, whilst accepting the challenge, accepting the scale of the fight, aren't there balancing out those counter forces. And that's what's going to have to change going forward, because we missed a huge opportunity around the stimulus package As Ken said in his presentation downstairs, China invested almost 34% of its stimulus package into clean energy technologies. In the UK, it was less than 1%, according to the New Economics Foundation. According to HSBC, it was around 6%. But in any case, 34% in China. And HSBC say that the world market for renewable clean technologies in 2020 will be worth more than $2 trillion. And so we need to kind of reframe the discussion away from where it was in Copenhagen, which was like a trade negotiation. When you go into a WTO trade negotiation, you say, how can I minimize my cost and maximize everyone else's? And it was similar in Copenhagen, and that countries turned up and they said, how can I get as much atmospheric space, like carbon territory, as I can, and reduce the amount that everybody else has? But if you go into the discussion like that, I will if you will, and secretly we all know that it's probably not possible and we're not making investments back home anyway and so on, then you're not going to go anywhere. So we have to reframe the entire discussion away from development, meaning having to make cuts, away to the sort of a vision of a low-carbon development path. But actually, that needs to look like solid money from Treasury. It needs to look like erecting wind farms. It needs to look like building ships that can go out and build these offshore wind farms. Because until we actually see a tangible low-carbon economy being built, it will remain like a myth. And so I think the focus going on is not on some kind of abstract UN process, vital as that's eventually going to be, in that only the UN can deliver rules that apply to everyone globally, only the UN can create the governance structures and the ways to verify that people are making the reductions they say they are, and so on. But until the politics changes back home, and until the major economies that claim to talk about low-carbon development and green growth actually start putting their money into it and building a low-carbon economy, then we can't possibly expect other developing countries and countries which don't have the same kind of progressive movements as we do in Europe to make those cuts. And so the very fact that Obama at the moment is trying to deliver a climate change bill which will deliver a 4% cut by 2020 on 1990 levels, compare that with 20% in Europe or 25% in Japan and the 40% the IPCC scientists say we need to see from developed countries. And his bill for a 4% cut contains 2 billion tonnes of offsets a year, which means that you wouldn't actually have to make a single reduction inside America until around 2026. But that bill is unlikely to pass because it's deemed too radical, and because the powerful forces of the right in America are doing everything they can to kill that bill. And so when you're faced with that kind of strength of opposition, unless there is a societal counterbalance pressure, i.e. us, as in, i.e. we need to build progressive movements of people who can see the opportunity for low-carbon development, for new industries, new jobs, improved national security because of reduced dependence on Middle Eastern oil and gas, and so on, until we can see the opportunities for health from public transport and all the positive benefits that building a low-carbon economy will bring, then they remain a rhetorical, aspirational dream of the green movement. And they stay in the fluffy vision of a sort of hippie society. And they don't become an actual reality that countries like China can see are an option that will be profitable, that will be prosperous. And so absolutely changing the kind of discussion away from one which is, how can I basically make the 80% cuts that Ed and his government have committed to in the UK through offsets as much as we can, paying people in developing countries to make reductions so that we don't have to, and go away from that towards an approach of building a low-carbon economy here. That has to be the focus, because until the politics and the political economy in major economies like ours, where we have the most progressive movement of anywhere, then Mexico will be exactly the same as Copenhagen was.